Good evening and welcome. I'm Professor Paul Kaufman, Dean of the Faculty of Business and Economics here at the University of Melbourne. I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the unceded land on which tonight's lecture is taking place. And I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, as well as to those joining us here tonight. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2025 Griffin Economic History Public Lecture. This year, we are celebrating the centenary anniversary of the establishment of the Bachelor of Commerce at the university and the Faculty of Business and Economics. We are proud of our faculty's global impact over the last century, and our public lectures reflect our continued commitment to knowledge sharing and creating space for rich and diverse discourse. The Griffin Economic History Public Lecture Series was established in 2019, and ancient history now, Peter, and made possible by the generous support of the Peter Griffin and Terry Swan Foundation. I would like to extend a warm welcome to you, Peter. Thank you for joining us tonight and keeping the faith of economic history. Peter is a University of Melbourne alumnus with a Bachelor of Commerce degree who has had a long and successful career in the business world, particularly in investment banking. He was honored as a member of the Order of Australia in 2008 for his service to the Australian community through support for medical research, the arts, and charitable organizations. Peter is passionate about economic history and hopes that students will leave the University of Melbourne with a solid understanding of business and finance, as well as a profound awareness of the mistakes made by governments, industry, and the banking sector in the past and present. I now invite Professor James Kung, Griffin Chair in Economic History, to introduce our distinguished speaker for the night. James?
Thank you, Paul. So it is my utmost pleasure to introduce Professor Nathan Nunn, a good friend and a great economist from the University of British Columbia. Nathan is currently a professor at the Vancouver School of Economics, where he holds a Canada Research Chair in Cultural Economics, among many other honorific titles. Before joining UBC, Nathan was a tenured full professor at Harvard University, where he started serving as an editor of the hugely prestigious and influential Quarterly Journal of Economics, or QJE, as we commonly call, one of the best, if not the best, journals in the economics profession. He continues to serve in that capacity to this day, despite his departure. Nathan has had a wide variety of research interests. Chief amongst them are political economy, economic history, economic development, cultural economics, and international trade. To me personally, and this is, Google Scholar agrees with me, Nathan is most famous for his works on the slave trade. So between his two papers, The Long-Term Effects of Africa's Slave Trades, published in QJE 2008, and The Slave Trade and the Origins of Mistrust in Africa, American Economic Review 2011, Nathan elucidates how slave trade systematically generated mistrust in the process, which in turn acted as a hindrance to economic development in the long run. The economics profession has paid due recognition to the contributions made by Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson with regard to the importance of institutions in economic development. They just won the Nobel Prize in Economics last year. I'm hopeful that our profession will, at some future point in time, similarly recognize the important role that culture plays in economic analysis, a point that Nathan has, as a pioneer, patently emphasized throughout his works. With his various co-authors, Nathan has done immensely creative research on, for example, the origin of gender roles and the potato's contributions to economic development, to name but a few examples. Professor Nunn has done far more fascinating works in the past 10 to 15 years than I am able to enumerate here tonight. If you want to find out more about his research, which I strongly urge you to do, please visit his personal website. Tonight, we are hugely honored that Professor Nunn is sharing his expertise with us on the current understanding on why human societies rely on culture, why cultural change tends to be slow-moving, and how cultural mismatches emerge. A few words on housekeeping. Tonight's presentation is being recorded, and the recording will be available on our faculty website soon. Following the presentation, there will be an opportunity for audience questions. Afterwards, the sponsor of this lecture, Mr. Peter Griffin, will share a few words with us. Professor Nunn, thank you for being here tonight, and the floor is now yours.
Round of applause to the tech. Yeah. So great. So thanks everyone for coming. It's my first time in Australia, and I've been here for a number of days already, just enjoying the great country, enjoying Melbourne. I love it. So it's like Canada, but exotic to me. So it's Canada, but cool. Okay. So that's great. As James mentioned, I lived in the US for about 15 years, from 2007 to 2022. So just recently moved back to Canada. While you're in the US, you can't help but to feel like the world is exceptionally different. Like there's a lot going on. There's a lot of crises. There's a lot of issues. And this is basically what this first slide basically highlights. Climate crisis, climate change is occurring. We have global inequality, population pressures, people trying to migrate around the world, but they can't because there are restrictions on migration. There's declining mental health. This is causing a huge amount of problems in high schools, but also not only children, but also adults as well. Okay, and then the striking thing is, it's not like we can agree that there are problems. So think of climate change, right? Half of Americans don't think that there's climate change induced by human action. And also the reason for declining mental health, there's a lot of people like my relatives that believe it's because we don't have Christianity in school now, which is different than those that believe, oh, it has to do with social media and other things. So really, it seems like we're at a special place in human history. I remember when I was growing up in the 80s, things looked rosy. It was great. The world, like I just thought things were just going to get better and better. Technology was going to get better and better. I remember Nintendo was invented. That was amazing. I just thought things were going to get better and better. But they didn't. And so that's not how they are today. So that's kind of on the personal side. I think a lot of you can relate to that. And then on the intellectual side, I was studying cultural evolution. I was studying economic history, but thinking about how societies evolve, how they change, how they adapt. And a lot of that is cultural practices, values, beliefs, traditions, etc. And then at some point, it struck me that this academic stuff I was studying explains a lot of the real world. And that's basically what this talk is going to be today. And I'm going to say something that you'll probably never hear an economist say. I don't know if I'm right, right? So I think I'm right. And the more I think about it, the more I dig into the evidence, the more I think there's some deep insights here. But I don't know if everything that I'm going to tell you today is 100% correct, right? But we can think about it together. We can brainstorm about it together. And in the Q&A, we can talk about it as well. So the first thing, this is all just review. Everyone knows this, climate change. There's been this dramatic increase in global warming in recent years. This is just data that shows that here. And so, that's not surprising to people. The other thing is, this might be more surprising, is global inequality, right? So kind of the world today is as unequal as it's ever been. This is just showing you inequality for the top 10% relative to the bottom 50%. And this is global. And I used to have another one where I just showed a whole bunch of different images for specific countries, and they're all the same. Since the 80s, inequality's gone up. Then I realized I didn't have Australia in there, so I thought, oh, okay, I can't do that. And I needed to cut off 20 minutes. So this is global, but if you look at any country in the world, South Korea, Canada, New Zealand, India, it's the same. And so part of this, and I think these two are related, is a rise in populism. People are not happy with the current situation. They're a bit unsure who to blame. The left will blame different people than the right. But what this has in common is populist political ideologies and the rise of populism. And so we've seen that. This is a recent American Economic Review paper, so very top journal, just documenting the rise of populism in the past decades. You'll see from the shading, it's a bit hard. One is left and one is right-wing populism. So it's on both sides, okay? And then the other one is a rise in despair. And this is probably the most dramatic, that like, despite we're pretty well off, we have, most parts of the world have good health care. We have, reasonable standard of living, but just depression is skyrocketing particularly amongst the younger generation. And you see that so much so that I believe it was 2023, the Surgeon General in the United States, the #1 health problem in that year, it was loneliness. That's what he documented was the epidemic that the US had to tackle in that year, okay? And then Angus Deaton, the Nobel laureate, has talked a lot about this as well. So just a fun one, you can go to Google Ngrams and just say, what are people writing about in books? And here is progress versus crisis. So in recent years, progress has gone down. That's similar to what I was saying when I was, growing up in the 80s. Progress was kind of what you thought the future was. We were just going to keep getting better and better. I think if somebody's a teenager today, they might think crisis is kind of what's going to characterize the future. And this Google Ngrams, just the incidence of these terms in our written corpus, is consistent with that. Okay. And this is so much so that there are even new words to describe things. So crisis typically, historically, was being temporary, but now it just seems like there's crisis every year, right? And so there's this new word. It was like, was it Collins Dictionary word of the year? And these are is permacrisis. So just this new thing that we now characterizes our world. Okay, so that's the world. Now let's think about research and the theory. And so the perspective that I come from is from cultural economics. So this new field of economics, which is probably only about 10 or 20 years old, it's linked to evolutionary anthropology, which is linked to evolutionary biology. The starting point here is we typically assume in economics that we're rational, right? People are, I'm sure everyone's familiar with that. So we're kind of calculating. We do constrained maximization problems. We're really good at calculus implicitly. But the reality is the world is highly complex. We don't have time to step back and make every decision using rationality or using kind of system 2 thinking, as Daniel Kahneman would call it. So instead, we've developed these heuristics. So lots of these are gut feelings or morals or rules of thumb, or religion would be an example. And that's a shortcut that helps us navigate these decisions. So there's something like 35,000 decisions that we have to make daily, okay? So the big issue is that we just don't have the cognitive capacity to act rationally. We have to have these heuristics, okay? And then one of these heuristics or shortcuts is every day or every generation, we don't reinvent the wheel. That we actually learn a lot from the wisdom of prior generations, right? So when parents teach us something, then we often take that and that saves a lot of saves a lot of time, saves a lot of processing costs because we listen to the wisdom of our parents. Okay, and that's called vertical transmission. The other thing that often happens is we'll listen to the wisdom of someone smart, someone maybe particularly rich, particularly intelligent that we look up to, and that's called horizontal transmission. Okay, so this transmission often takes the form of, like I said, customs, religions, certain moral values, which are passed down from generation to generation. Okay. So let me just, that might just be words, but this has been studied for decades and decades. And let me give you a few examples of why reliance on tradition is so beneficial. The top picture is how maize is traditionally cooked in Latin America. And so maize would be dried, so this is corn, and then you would boil it. You boil it for about 40 minutes, and then you would drain the water and you would mash it up into a dough, and that would be masa. And then you could make tortillas, tamales, enchiladas, whatever. But what they do historically is you take some dirt or some limestone and you throw it in the water. right? Or you take some ash from the fire and you throw it in the water. If you ask people, and I've given this talk to people from Latin America, and they'll each have their own stories about why their grandmothers do that and why they even do that today. So even today, you buy bags of cement in the grocery store and then you put them in the water. They say, oh, it tastes better, it's good for you, blah, blah, blah. And so that's debatable. And I don't think anyone really knew historically why they did it. It turns out why you would want to do that and why that's a food culture that's emerged in a tradition is because corn is really deficient in niacin, also some amino acids, but niacin in particular. And if you don't have enough niacin, you'll develop a disease called pellagra. And that disease, you'll get rashes, dementia, and you'll eventually die, right? And so if you cook it this way, this helps the body absorb the small amounts of niacin in the corn, and you won't get pellagra. Okay, so there's some interesting stories about, corn is indigenous to the Americas. It was brought to Lesotho. It was brought to northern Italy, but this food culture was not brought. And then people developed pellagra, and then no one knew why. They knew there's a correlation with corn. They thought, oh, it's mold in corn or other things. And it wasn't until 1940 that a scientist named Joseph Goldberger figured it out. He was so certain that it was just a dietary deficiency that he took blood from people who had pellagra and injected it into his wife and his kids, right? And so they didn't, everyone thought it was communicable. It wasn't, right? But still no one believed him, and then he died. And then a few years later, it was figured out, right? So the point here, though, is the tradition of these indigenous people in the Americas knew or was able to do the right thing, maybe because of false reasons, but they were able to do the right thing. So they were actually quite intelligent, and even more intelligent than all these scientists in the early 20th century were in the world, right? So there's other examples of this. The second image here is something called scapulomancy, which is divination by looking at bones. And this is the Naskapi, which are in the northern territory of what's today is Quebec. And basically the story here is they hunt caribou. And the thing about caribou is if they know where you're going to go, they're going to go the other way, right? So, how do you optimize in that situation? It turns out in game theory, there's the optimal action is a mixed strategy Nash equilibrium. So where you randomize, right? The bad thing is humans aren't good at randomizing, right? So we tend to develop patterns even if we're trying to randomize, or we do negatively autocorrelated. So what did they do? Well, they believed that their ancestors told them where to hunt through these bones that they burnt in the fire, and they would crack a certain way. And the cracking would tell them which direction they should head, okay? And so that's basically their tradition, and that tradition was beneficial, and they chose the right action, even though you could say those beliefs are wrong. It led to these actions which were beneficial. So in Bali, there's something similar in terms of planting and the religious beliefs, but I won't talk about that. So the key to this here is that you can't question the tradition. If people started questioning this, said, oh, this is silly, why are we cooking with this ash? I'm not doing that. Then the tradition's not going to work, right? So there has to be some faith in the tradition, some inherent value placed in the tradition. And that's what's emerged in societies, right? You can see all societies around the world, it's essentially human universal, to follow the traditions that are passed on from previous generations. So what this does, though, is it leads to something which is basically a status quo bias. We're hesitant to change the way that we do things. Okay, this is basically a behavioral trait. So you might think that's not true. If I know there's something better, I'll do it, right? I'm not. So there's an experiment run by Steve Levitt. He's the author of Freakonomics, so you might have heard of him. It's a freaky experiment. He actually got people who were about to make an important decision in life, like, should I get divorced? Should I quit my job? Should I get a new job? Should I change careers? And he said, I want you to flip a coin and then make the decision based on that coin flip. So then you're randomizing whether they're changing or not. And not everybody followed it, but some people followed it, which is amazing. So then you get some random variation in people changing things in their lives or holding constant. And the ones that changed systematically did better, right? So that's saying they were not optimizing before because they were kind of indifferent, and then they systematically did better, right? Others have looked at elections. We see the same thing in politics with close election RDs. The individuals, if you get a new leader, you'd systematically do better compared to the counterfactual. Okay, so the last point is this might appear suboptimal, right? The Levitt finding, you might think, oh, people aren't optimizing, they're not acting rationally. And that's true, they're not acting rationally in the economic sense, but in the bigger long run sense, in terms of evolution, they are acting rationally because it's that resistance to change that gets us these benefits here, right? And so in a dynamic evolutionary sense, this is the best you can do in this big game. When you zoom in and just have a snapshot on the short run, then it seems like people are doing dumb things, okay? Okay, so then what happens, and this is a lot of my research has been on this, but I won't dwell on it because this leads to historical persistence, right? So if you look at societies or variation across societies at one point in time, and then you look, let's say, hundreds of years later, then that variation seems to hold. Okay, so you see that with technology. Countries that were richer in the past tend to be richer today or have higher levels of technology. Even there's a great paper by Nico Voigtlander and Hans-Joachim Voth that looks at anti-Semitism amongst basically rural villages in Germany, and anti-Semitism, levels of anti-Semitism during the Black Death correlate very strongly with the levels in the early 20th century, right? And so that's over 500 years, 400 or 500 years. Okay. Even themes in historical folk tales, right? If you come from a society, you have certain folk tales that have a story, you tend to like American movies that have that story as well, and not movies that have a different story, right? And that's preferences for certain narratives. And even work I've done with Paolo Giuliano, democratic values. So if historically you had local politics, village level politics, where you voted about who would be the local headman, then today you think democracy is a better form of government on average. Okay, so there's persistence. We're hesitant to change. So that all sounds great. Culture is great. And actually, this is basically what the literature says. Like, isn't it this great evolutionary hack that we can even be better than rational? So that's true, but what happens when the environment changes? What happens if the world is just completely different than it has been 10 years ago or 50 years ago, okay? And I'm going to argue that the world today could be different than the world of 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. So, but what happens here, basically, this figure is showing you, that won't quite work. Let me use this. This figure is basically showing you right here at period 0, the world changes, the optimal action then changes, right? The old culture is no longer aligned with the world, and so we should change. And so what should happen is 100% of the population, if they're kind of doing everything as efficiently as possible, should adopt the new action, and that's what's on the y-axis, okay? So the line that goes straight up is if people were perfectly informed and they adopted the new action, but because our society, humans, rely on tradition, you don't immediately jump to the new action. Instead, you converge to the new action very slowly. Okay, and the lines that are slower have slower convergence. This is all from a mathematical model. The lines with slower convergence are because that society relies more strongly on tradition, right? In the model, there's an extent to which you rely on tradition or not. And I won't go into the details, but all of that is endogenous, right? That emerges depending on the environment, a bunch of parameters. And the point, though, is that we're not going to be optimizing always, right? When the world changes, we're going to be off a little bit, right? So that's the cost. The benefit is, remember, the processing of maize. How, that's the benefit. So it's a trade-off between those two things, okay? So the graph on the left, that's showing you the extent of mismatch. That's just the shaded area. That's all of the area over all the generations that you're off, right? And so that's the imperfection, okay? So that's the cost. So this is well known in biology, okay? So there's something called evolutionary mismatch, and I think it's nice to have the example. Not that I think that it's literally the same, but I think it helps illustrate this. I think the most well-known example is of sea turtles. So sea turtles they're in the sea, right? Hence the name, I guess. They lay eggs on the sand. They bury the eggs on the sand, then they go back to the sea. And then the hatchlings hatch, and then they have to figure out how to get to the sea, right? You might not think of it, but oh yeah, how do they know these things that are just been born, how you get to the sea? So they've developed a heuristic where they just follow any bright light, right? So if it's dark, you can kind of see there, the moonlight is going to shine off the water, and they'll head straight to the water. Even in the daytime, similarly, the sun will shine off the water. And so it's this great heuristic, right, that's worked fantastic for thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. But then the environment changed, right? So in Costa Rica, this is common. What do? Well, the beach is really nice, so you build condos by the beach. You build a freeway by the beach, right? And so now when they look around, they see all these other lights, right? But it's car headlights on a freeway that's going right by the beach. So they start heading towards the freeway, or they start heading towards the city, right? And so this is a heuristic or a trait, in this case, biological trait that worked great. Then the environment changed, and then it works terribly. Okay, and so this is an extreme example, but I think it helps to illustrate things. And of course, if they could change instantly and no longer use that and use another heuristic, it'd be fine. But that's not how evolution works, right? And that's not how, yeah. Okay. So is there evidence for mismatch? Okay, so I won't go through these examples, but there is evidence which has emerged. It's usually not framed this way. So some of the work that I've done that James Kung was talking about, where I looked at the slave trade over 300-400 years within Africa, some groups were intensively enslaved, and they were actually enslaved by each other often, right? So within the community, people would be enslaving others. In that environment, you can think very quickly developing distrust or a norm of distrust of others is going to be beneficial, right? Because people tricked each other into slavery. And what you see today is that places that had the slave trade's over, had the slave trade for 400 years, those places have lower levels of trust of others, even of others in their family, of their neighbors within their ethnic group. Okay, so that worked great during the slave trade. But the world has changed, the slave trade is over, and now trust is super important for business, right? And so now that trait is mismatched for the current environment, okay? There's other examples. I think another great example is my student, Marcella Alsan. There's this kind of horrid experiment in the United States, this Tuskegee medical experiment, where they wanted to understand the life cycle of syphilis. So for Black men in Tuskegee, Alabama, they allowed them to die. They had syphilis, they didn't treat them, they knew how to treat them, but they wanted to monitor what happened and allowed them to die. So they just wanted to really understand the life cycle. And then in 1972, this became known, there was an expose, and even today, Black men, she shows, are really hesitant to go to the doctor, right? And so you think, well, that makes sense given the history, but today maybe that's mismatched, right? In their mind, they're probably thinking, no, it's, we're justified, and it's plausibly mismatched. So there's other examples, a lot of examples. The last 3 bullet points are about bad medical practices in recent history, and then how people change their behavior because of that. Okay, so we know that we rely on culture, we rely on tradition, right? That generates persistence. The persistence can generate mismatch. Okay, now here's a bunch of Greek, which you really don't need to know. For those that are a bit more inclined, I put it up here because this is the core of evolutionary theory. This is called the replicator dynamic. Okay, so all I means is a trait or a group, right? And then the QI is the proportion of the population that has that trait or belongs to that group. Okay, and the pi is that is just the payoffs of the group. So all this is saying is if a group or a particular trait has higher payoffs or higher fitness, it's called, than average, then they'll grow. If you have worse payoffs or worse fitness than average, you'll shrink. So it's there's going to be a form of competition between the groups, and the groups with the good traits will do better, and they'll evolve over time, and the ones with the bad traits will do worse. Okay? So then we can start to think about which traits won out and lost out in history. And the other thing we want to think about is, well, what's the nature of this competition, right? And I think I could talk for about an hour on this, but I'll just do this really quickly. Historically, there's kind of 2 forms of competition. One form is one group grows, right? Because their payoff is higher, they're more attractive to people because they attract other people into their group, okay? And this is very common in Africa, where the saying is wealth in people, and you would often absorb people into your lineage, right? So if one lineage was more appealing, higher standard of living, people are happier, maybe more equality, then others would join it, and then that group and that trait would grow, okay? The other form is violent competition, right? Remember, your trait has to be better than average. So, but the other way is if you can kind of destroy your competitor and lower their payoff, right, rather than raise yours, that's a way to outcompete the competitor. So another way is through violent forms of competition. This would be more like the history of Europe, where you had states that went to war with other states, and then the states that were more economically powerful or were able to conquer other states, well, then those traits spread. Okay, it's a famous, scholar, Charles Tilley, that basically said war made states and states made war, right? And that's the emergence of Europe and why certain states were able to survive. So it's really the survival of the fittest. Okay, and so it's really number two that has been, I would argue, quantitatively the most important in developing the traits around the world that we observe today. And I'll talk more about that. Okay, so then we could think about, why is it that certain cultures around the world have spread, right? And I think all of you know, okay, Western European cultures, a place like Australia, a place like Canada, it's basically Western European cultures kind of dominated other cultures, okay? So why is that? So those of you that read Guns, Germs, and Steel, you probably know the answer, which is, well, Europeans were technologically superior. So of course they did, okay? So that could be. I'm going to tell you one story that makes us pause and think a little bit. This is 2013. I was doing some field work in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I don't know if you can see it in the very top. It's right in the middle of, Congo's in the middle of Africa. This place we went to, Mushenge, is right in the middle of the Congo, okay? And there's pictures from Mushenge, which was the capital of this really famous kingdom called the Kuba Kingdom, okay? And we were interested in doing some research, as economists, run regressions, take something interesting and turn it boring into statistics. That's what we did. But the big thing we were worried about was, because we were interested in what's the causal effect of the Kuba Kingdom, is, well, the boundaries of the kingdom are endogenous, right? So what determined how far the kingdom spread? And it was bounded by rivers, but how come they didn't spread even further, okay? And the interesting thing about the Kuba Kingdom is there's a neighboring, not kingdom, but set of villages, right, called, that was inhabited by a group called the Lele. But they were descended from the same individual named Woot. Okay, so I remember we had a focus group with the regent of the kingdom, which is in the middle, and it was about 4 hours asking him a ton of questions. And multiple times I asked, "Why did you not conquer the Lele?" The Lele were right beside you. The kingdom was super powerful. It had been studied by anthropologists, had twice the income level at least. I had a military. The Lele didn't have a military. It had a police force. It had taxation. It was far superior. So why didn't the Kuba conquer the Lele? Okay, and I won't forget. He looked at me, especially the first time I asked, and just thought I was crazy. He's like, he probably thought I was psychotic. And the reason is, why would you even think of doing that, right? So he just looked at me and said, why would we do that? That's the top here. He said, the Lele are our brothers. Like, it just didn't occur to them, right? And there are some kingdoms prior to the slave trade, which is a whole other episode, which did emerge, but they just never expanded. They really didn't have this kind of the desire for conquest, right? And so, sure, certain groups, historically, we've seen cases of this. So like China in the 15th century were more powerful, could sail to other locations, but they didn't conquer them, right? And so why didn't they conquer them? And one reason is, well, and this has been studied by Tej Rai, Raymond Fisk, is in order to do something, you really have to have a moral justification. It's really hard. I think we're all good-hearted. And so to do something really horrid is really, really tough for us. right? So if you're going to do something like conquer another society, you have to have a moral justification, or you have to believe that what you're doing is the right thing. Okay. And so why is it that certain societies were able to do that? Well, there's a few traits, and this has been studied. I didn't make this up myself. This has been studied already. One is a belief in a universal God. So this happened around the Axial Age, so 6,000, 8,000 BC. Started with the Zoroastrians, and then the Abrahamic religions are an example of groups that have this. But it's pretty common. And so once you believe in a universal God, I'll talk more about this, then you have a justification for helping the other group by colonizing them or enslaving them or taking over and civilizing them. Okay. And so the reason is there's only why is a universal God important? There's only one God, right? You can have a belief that there's multiple gods, and so when that other society has a different God, that's perfectly fine, right? But if you really believe there's only one God, then they're wrong, and you're obligated to help them, right? So the other thing that's happened, and this is again the Axial Age, is a belief in that the world is non-relational. So prior to the Axial Age, there's a belief that we're all integrated. The natural world, the spiritual world is integrated. So we're closely tied with ancestors and also people who are unborn, right? We're also closely tied with animals. And basically the division between the natural world and spiritual world occurred around the Axial Age. And I'll talk about the implications that has. And then also we developed this thing, which I've learned, in the Congo where I do a lot of field work, they don't view the world this way, about randomness. Like things just happen. There's good luck, there's bad luck. And so they believe in a non-deterministic world, a lot of indigenous societies, including the Congo where I work. And that's important, right? So if there's certain groups in your society who are poor, you might have an obligation to help them out, right? And that poverty, if you believe in a non-deterministic world, or sorry, if you believe in a deterministic world, because that poverty, there's a reason for it. And it's because of all the connections that exist. Okay, I'll talk more about that. And what was super important for conquest was surplus, right? Having inequality, having a class that was poor so that you could have economic surplus that could be put towards military means. Okay. So I won't be able to go into all of these details, so I just want to give you a few examples of each. I'll talk a little bit about the universal God. And so this is a great example from the US. So I apologize, most of my examples are from, or a lot of examples are from the US, having lived there. This is a painting called American Progress by John Gass. So famous painting, 1872. And basically it depicts the westward expansion of the United States. Okay, and there's a few things you can see: the bison, which we'll come back to, being driven off to the left, the indigenous population being driven off to the left, but then there's this angelic figure that's laying the telegraph. I don't know if you can quite see that, and the railway is being laid as well, right? So it's really believed that it was kind of God's will, and it was a civilizing mission to expand westward, right? And that's not uncommon, actually. If we look at historically, there was the doctrine of discovery, which was the Catholic Church, that basically divided the world into Portugal and Spain, and said you can conquer, any group that you want as long as they're not Christian, right? And the reason was because we're helping them out. Okay, civilizing mission was another justification. This idea that some wars are just if there is a reason that you're having them, and part of the reason was to civilize groups that are not civilized, and then manifest destiny, which was it was God's will for the U.S. to expand westward. Okay, so again, I think the real issue here is it's not natural for us to want to colonize another society, to want to conquer another society, to want to enslave another society. Oops. And so having these beliefs, which are traditions, which are passed down, are important, right? And okay. Oh, and then the slave trade you see, which I've studied a lot, examples of this as well, right? So typically slaves, when they were captured, would be given a first name that was Christian. They're converted to Christianity, and then their last name would be their ethnicity. Okay, and that was the main justification, is that they're converted to Christianity. And I talk about Christianity because my background is Christian. I know a lot about it. But it's the same thing for the Arab slave trade, which actually dates back much earlier than the transatlantic slave trade, 600 AD. And there, Muslims couldn't enslave other Muslims, but you could enslave people that weren't Muslims because that was the benefit, right? And we see examples of this today. So here's just a famous example that was in the news in the United States. It was basically a private school. So as you know, in the US, the public schools in general are not good. You have to have a private school. In this area here, it was the only private school available, and it was a Christian private school. And then these are indigenous children or indigenous students. And on the weekends, they would engage in their traditional dances, right? Kind of traditional rituals. And then that was viewed as being, within that framework, as being satanic. And when you have a universal God and there's like your God and nothing else, then that's the only logical implication, right? At least some people will believe that. And so then they were expelled. But that tells you, this is like a modern equivalent of the relationship between that high God religion and then these indigenous religions, right? Okay, so I won't dwell on that, except to say, if those are stories, they're just words. If you look at data, the data are also pretty consistent, right? The one thing I'll say is there is a literature saying that actually having universal high gods is great, because it makes the group cohesive and people cooperate with one another, but that's the group. But then it's like there's the other group, the out group, that doesn't fare so well, right? And the reason that the group is cohesive is because you've created this other that you're contrasting against, and that's a common enemy, basically. So we see that universal high God religions tend to have more conflict historically and today, and that they're associated with less tolerance, basically. And it's just because of the logic of that belief. So it's nothing normative. It's just the logical implication. So if we look historically, this is a really rough set of data that I'm working on. This is historically prior to the Columbian Exchange, prior to 1500, the prevalence of ethnic groups that believe in a universal high God. Okay, so there's some mistakes I know already, like Northern Italy isn't quite right. You might wonder why Greenland has these stripes. It's because we really don't know the exact location of groups. We just know there's rough centroid, and then we draw regions, right? But the main thing I want to show here, this is in 1500, right? And then this is today. So here the polygons are a bit more precise. We know uninhabited land. There's about 7,000 language groups. And we see a lot more purple, right? A lot more groups in the world that believe in a universal high God. And this is really because of just the spread of Western Europeans around the world, right? Yeah. So it's basically just language groups, right? So in Australia, you'll have English, and then so that'll be give you the traits of English. In Brazil, Portuguese. So it's crude, but I think it's like everyone knows this, that high God religions have spread around the world. And even if you look at conversion to Christianity, Africa is going to be all purple, for example, right? And then the other thing, which I think is kind of fun too, is, well, we can get other evidence, and this evidence is from folk tales. So if you have folk tales, and then we just look using either hand coding or using an LLM, do these folk tales involve ancestral spirits, right? So that's kind of the converse of having a universal God. So the universal God is like there's one God, it's the ancestor of all of us, right? The other belief in most societies is, well, my group has its ancestors, and then I go next door, there's another group, and they're a different lineage, so of course they have a different ancestor. So if they trace back, they're going to have a different God. I'm going to have a different God, right? It's just that logic that leads to tolerance naturally through the logical progress. So then here's folk tales that talk about not a single God, but ancestors, right? And you can see in Europe, you don't have a lot of darkness, right? There's not many folk tales that talk about ancestors. And then over time, what do we see? Well, we see a lot less purple, right? Again, that's just the converse, right? Okay, so that's the one trait. The other trait I'm going to talk about, and this one, again, I'm only going to be able to touch on this really briefly, is this view of a more disconnected world, right? And so that's the human world and the natural world are disconnected, for example, and also this determinism, which I won't talk about as much, okay? So once you, actually having a view that the world is disconnected, right? That's the natural world and supernatural world, the natural world and humans are disconnected, and also that the things are not deterministic has a number of benefits. So one is, like I said, surplus, because you're okay with inequality. This is, I think, another great example. This is one of the main reasons that Americans were able to expand westward in the frontier, because the frontier was basically inhabited by Plains Indians, and they were actually economically, well, I guess they were physically very tall, which kind of tells us they were economically successful, right? And so the idea was, well, we want to use their land, so we want to put them on reserves, right? But they're actually quite powerful. How do we get them on reserves? Well, basically they live off of hunting buffalo or bison. And so if we can just decimate the bison, then we'll remove their food supply and they'll willingly go onto reserves, right? And so that's what they did. Just in a matter of decades, they decimated the bison. This tells you the populations here. You probably can't read the numbers, but it's within a few decades, and then all wild bison by the late 19th century are gone, right? There's no wild bison today, right? And then, well, so if you read the history, it's basically, some of the bison was actually a fairly small percentage were used for hides, but people would do things like you would travel on the train across the US, you would see a bunch of bison, everyone would pull out their guns, the train would stop, and you would just shoot them all, right? And that was part of this kind of general effort to engage in this strategy. So that's because I think people and at the time or that culture didn't believe that they were connected to animals, right? There's this belief that humans are up here and then animals are there to serve humans, right? And this again is the axial age, this kind of innovation that occurred in many parts of the world. It's not just Europeans. This is they're not the only culture to have this innovation, but we can contrast that to how basically the Plains Indian, in this case the Blackfoot, saw themselves in relation to the bison, right? So they actually saw the bison as relatives, that as equals, and they engaged in a reciprocal relationship with the bison, right? So many societies had this view, so that like the Inuit in northern Canada, they viewed themselves as having a reciprocal relationship with seals, and when they killed the seal, they believed in reincarnation, the seal would return the favor by coming back. And when they killed it, they would give it some water and would treat it very nicely. And that was their belief about the reciprocal relationship, right? The indigenous population near Vancouver, they actually believed that salmon were up here and that humans were down here, right? And their logic was, oh, because without salmon, humans wouldn't be alive, right? But without humans, salmon would be totally fine, right? And so it's like they really rely on them. So it's just a very different view of the world, and it's humans not at the top. So I would suggest they would really have been unable to engage in this behavior. And this behavior was super efficient and great for settling the west of the United States, right? It was great to have these, and it's these cultural traits that made this society able to expand culturally, basically. Okay. So we can look at the folktale data again. So these are folktales where nature has agency. You can see in Europe, there's not a lot of that. In other parts of the world, this is in 1500. And then the switch with the expansion of European culture is we see a lot less purple. Okay, so the idea that nature, natural objects, animals, plants, etc., have agency, can take actions in these folk tales. You see this, and then this is also stratification, just the amount of stratification in society. A lot, that's inequality. A lot in Europe. But not the rest of the world, but then the expansion of Europe, and you see that, okay? So these are the kind of the traits, I'm trying to give you a sense of the traits, the cultural traits that expanded over time. Okay, so the winning traditions had these traits, and I would say, and this is the main point, and I think this is right, but I'm happy to debate and argue and revise my thinking. The problems today, so these traits were great at conquering other societies, at expanding and imperialism and all the things that we've seen historically. But today's challenges to me seem different, right? So rising inequality, rising discontent, deteriorating mental health, environmental crises. So what's different is it seems like none of these can be solved by conquering other populations. You might think, oh, we could conquer other populations and then they wouldn't try and take boats and migrate to our country, right? But I don't know that that's going to be the solution. Climate change, I don't know that that's going to be the solution either. And I think definitely mental health, I don't think that's going to be helped at all by conquering other societies. So, you know, we had the example of the sea turtles. So the question is here, are the traditions that have been successful in the past, are they somehow mismatched or not particularly well suited to these new problems that we face, right? They might not be mismatched, but at the least I could say they're not well suited, right? And so, so at the very least, I think we would think it's unlikely the answers only lie in those cultures, that some of the answers might lie elsewhere. If they're mismatched, most of the answers will lie elsewhere, right? Which is a stronger statement. So this is just some information on a changing world. There's a declining focus on conquest. So that makes sense, right? It's not a top goal of even, well, I don't know, with Trump now, maybe that's going to change. And maybe that's a whole other issue. But prior to Trump and Putin, it wasn't a top goal. But where is the focus now? On inequality, universal human rights, and these sorts of things, right? It's like let's make all of the world better, okay? And I think those are the traits that we want to think about. What traits are going to make all of the world better, right? And so I'm just going to give you a few examples. One, and this is an example from southeastern Nigeria. There's an ethnic group called the Igbo, but you know, most Bantu beliefs, African beliefs are similar. And that's the belief that the universe, everything is connected. Okay, and so they actually use the analogy of a spider's web. So if you pull on any part of the spider's web, all parts of the web move. Okay, so there's two things here. We're all connected and it's deterministic, right? There's no sense in which, oh, randomly it might move or not move. They really believe everything is deterministic, right? And so, and there's just, you know, different proverbs along those lines. So if that's the case, anything you do, you're always thinking about how it affects others, and it will affect others. Is it going to affect others in a positive way or a negative way? Okay. So what's central in these societies, they're called relational societies in the psychology literature, or holistic societies, is what's central are relationships. So if you ask people, what is the world made of in these societies? They'll say relationships. Right? In our society, we would say, oh, there's people, you group them together and then they form a university or they form a city. They would say, no, it's a complex web of bilateral relationships. Everybody's connected to everybody. So then what's your primary goal in life and what are children taught? They're taught to live life while maintaining the overall quality of that whole spider's web, not to do anything that messes up or has negative actions that reverberate all across society. Okay, so you can start to think about these goals, about wanting all of our world to be well functioning and everybody in it to work well, and also the fact that, you know, what China does affects us through global warming, what happens in developing countries affects us through migration. Then you can think, well, a worldview like this might not be so terrible, right? Versus an individualistic worldview that's more like, it's a free country, I can do what I want, don't infringe upon my rights. Okay. Okay, so in those environments, like I said, what's central is relationships. So what are people always trying to do? This is one thing we learned when we started working in the Congo. They're always trying to cultivate relationships. They're always trying to invest in relationships. They're trying to help each other out, etc. And so what's the number one determinant when you go look at the literature, it turns out, of happiness and actually longevity, how long you live? It's the number of meaningful relationships you have in life. Okay, and what's been declining over time in the US and most developing countries, it's meaningful relationships. Okay, and this is, I think this is great. This is a science article showing that amongst all these mammals studied, you find this relationship between number of relationships these mammals have, like orcas or different monkeys, even rodents. and longevity, that it's all positive and significant except for one, right? So if those rodents that have more friends live longer, it turns out. Okay. And then the other piece of literature from psychology, and this is again reasons why I think this other way of viewing the world might not be terrible, because in these other ways of viewing the world, what we see is people lend money to each other, they give money to each other, and they help each other out. So in economics, we call this a kin tax, and we view it very negatively because we're thinking, oh, why are people doing that? That's not right. But it turns out if you go to psychology, you see there seems to be a universal, and that's giving money to someone else basically makes you happier, right? It's so strong that if an individual has money, if I have $100 and I want to say, how do I convert that to happiness? What's the best thing I can do? I'll be happier if I just give it away than if I spent it on a spa treatment or even a taxi or something like that. Okay, so that's a universal. It was found in the U.S. and then it's been subsequently replicated, basically. And Elizabeth Dunn, who's a psychologist, has done an extensive amount of work on this, right? So these societies that have this kin tax, where they keep like spending money on each other, and we think that's weird and not helpful for investment and economic growth. That's actually like a societal hack, right? You give someone money, you're happier. They give you money, you're happier. And that seems great. And that is the equilibrium that exists in many parts of the world that are more relational. Okay, so then you might think, well, but the one thing Europeans are really great at, and these individualistic cultures, which I'm not sure is true. I can talk more about that, but it's like getting higher income, right? And so some of it might have been at the expense of the societies that were colonized, but at the very least, we know that societies that are richer today are happier, right? So how does that square? Because these relational societies tend to be poorer. So there's a great study in PNAS just in 2024 where they said, well, the problem is all these studies are just like people online. So we're not really getting these small scale relational societies like the Cuba. Okay, and so then they brought them into the study, and they're the orange ones here. Okay, so you see this positive relationship between income and happiness. That's the purple ones. And then, but when you go and find these relational societies, these small scale societies, so historically we call these primitive societies non-industrial. It's like there's a positive relationship, but it's shifted up, right? Everyone's happier. Okay, and that would be, again, consistent with the literature on relationships being super important. You don't need cell phones, you don't need cars, you don't need that, those sorts of things, right? It does help, like for sure. If you have money to fix tooth with cavities, it's helpful, but yeah. Okay, increasing importance of climate change and adaptation, that's been increasing over time. So in a society like the Igbo society, the belief is that nature and animals have agency, and often they're even vessels for ancestral spirits. And there's a connection between the ancestral world and the natural world. So again, everything's connected. So if you look at this baobab tree, it could very well be, and it's believed to be, a vessel for your ancestors. If you look at this python, it's believed to be a messenger. It's the way that you talk to your ancestors. So clear-cutting forests, like was done in Europe in the medieval period, would be like decimating your ancestors, right? It's again like decimating the bison. So you can see you're going to have a very different view about the climate and how you handle the climate and how you integrate with the climate. And we can contrast that to the view of the winning cultures where humans are on top, right? And animals are to serve them. And even the view of the descendants of winning cultures in the US, where 50% of people in the US think, well, humans could never affect the climate. The climate's over there, we're over here, completely disconnected, and it's arrogant for us to think that we could, right? That's a view where you're not, recognizing or don't believe in those connections. And then there's a lot of literature that actually says, if you, and I'm short on time, so I'll talk about the last one. In Nepal, they moved from national regulation of forest management and said, oh, we'll just let these local populations do it, right? And these local populations had these beliefs that I described, where you actually believe that forests had spirits. And then you found in a matter of years, basically, oops, that's telling me I should wrap up. in a number of years, reforestation dramatically increased, okay? And we see examples today. This is another great example where and this is New Zealand, parts of Canada, Colombia, Bangladesh, basically natural entities are given legal standing as human beings, right? And the logic is, well, in our belief system, that's the case. They're as much kind of have human characteristics or as humans, right? But legally, this is super important because suddenly, if a river has legal status as a human, then it has the right not to be harmed, right? So you don't need to prove that someone polluting a river harmed a human, but actually it has right to not be harmed on its own. So, so today in the World Bank, the IMF, it tends to be dominated by individuals from these winning cultures, right? Which makes sense. But I guess the one thing I'd like to put out there is, well, we might actually gain a lot by bringing in the voices of the cultures that were marginalized historically, okay? And there's one example here, which is a student of mine, Ariel Bernhardt, where amongst this tribal group called the Adivasis in India, she finds that actually the Adivasis were able to teach the Hindus who are a higher status about tolerance, about gender equality, about integration with others, even if they're at a lower caste within society, right? So this kind of low tribal group, villages in the region that she studied that had more Adivasis, then they developed these more tolerant groups, right? So you can learn from groups that are lower status or that are marginalized if what they have to offer or what they're showing you is less mismatched for the environment, right? And the reason they adopted these was because there are economic benefits, right, to allowing women to work, for example, right, or to interacting with everyone in society. Okay, so there's one alternative view, and I just want to go through this really, really quickly, is, well, and I'm fully open to this, that history's winning traditions are perfectly well suited to face the new challenges. So they were superior in the past, and they'll be superior today. Okay, there is no mismatch, right? So I've thrown out the idea that possibly there is mismatch. So we should double down and invest more heavily in their promotion. Okay, so we see this in development economics that's dominated by people from European, Western European, and their offshoots countries. And that's not a bad thing. We should even focus more on people from those traditions because they are superior. So there's a few reasons to question this line of reasoning, I would just say. So the one thing, if people say, well, what was Western Europe good at? Well, it was innovation. And I think there's I could talk a whole bunch about, is it really innovation because they're culturally superior, or is it because they got cheap raw materials and had a large market for goods and then needed to innovate to keep up? But even if we say, okay, no, Western European culture, analytic culture is great in innovation and other societies can't innovate, the big issue here is we know in economics that there's diminishing returns to everything, and we're seeing diminishing returns to knowledge creation. So there's an AER paper by Nick Bloom on the left, basically where the resources devoted to knowledge creation are going up over the past century, and then the returns are declining. Okay, so that's the two lines. Basically, effort is increasing, returns are declining. And then this one on the right, which I think is a really, really cute one, is Ben Jones has looked at when are people innovating, like Nobel Prize winners, scientists, et cetera. It's getting harder and harder to make these breakthrough innovations, and they're occurring later and later in life. So it used to be like in your 20s, you discover this thing, and now you have to work for 40 years before you even get a marginal innovation. So we seem to have this decline in innovation, which is occurring. And then the last warning, then I'll end. In evolution, it's not that traits are universally better. If you say, oh, that trait is superior, it doesn't mean anything in evolution, right? So just to take an example, imagine there's an evolutionary trait that makes you more generous or more giving, right? Is that superior, right? Well, it depends on what the others do. If you give them and then they take away, and then you just keep doing that, that's terrible. But if it's a society where you give and then they give back and then everyone's better off, that's great, right? So it just depends on the environment. And then another fun one is height. So, if you're growing up in the United States now and the NBA exists, it's great to be 7 feet tall, right? If it's 400 years ago and food is scarce, it's not good to have genes that makes you that large, right? That's why statures were smaller. So in the past, the winning traditions have solved many of the world's prior problems, right? But the question is, will they solve future problems, right? So is actually innovation and the willingness to create new technological innovations to improve upon things, is that actually going to make us better? And it depends on the environment. And here's just an example. There are these things called kludges. This is evolutionarily. And sometimes improving things makes you worse off, okay? And so here's an example. This is called the bony flatfish. The bony flatfish, this is from Richard Dawkins, used to swim in the ocean like this. It was symmetric, eyes on both sides. And then over time, evolutionarily, it went to the bottom of the ocean and then became a bottom feeder. So then it was like laid down sideways and ate stuff. But then one eye is in the dirt, right? So then it evolves and slowly there's innovation, it incrementally moves over, and its organs had to all do all these weird things. But if you look at it, it's all this lopsided, weird organism, and you would never design an organism that way, right? It's because of the history, but every incremental change kind of in some sense improves upon things because the eye's not in the sand, but it's messing up the organism even more, okay? So then just the last thing I want to leave you with, I guess this is, I don't know if I'm being very negative, are some of the innovations that we have kludges? Are they moving us in a direction that's not great? So, you know, Robert Putnam, 50 years ago, almost, maybe 40, maybe a little bit less, 30 years ago, but talking about 50 years ago, talked about the decline in social capital in the United States. People are doing things alone in isolation, they're more lonely, but then we had an innovation, right? So now like the eye of the fish is starting to move, we have social media. So you might not have friends, but you can get online and then you can reach others, right? I remember teaching Robert Putnam about 15 years ago to students at Harvard, and then them saying, oh yeah, but social, you know, the internet, we now have the internet. The evidence seems to be that social media makes you more lonely. So you get a little bit of a hit if you post something and someone likes it, right? But there are these longer run things which make you more isolated. And one is that you're online and you're not making real connections in the world. And it's the real connections we saw, which are kind of the more fundamental source of happiness, right? So and the other thing with social media and cell phones is then we have things like we need coltan, we need lithium, we need all these sorts of things, and that's not great for the environment. There's even now things that say, well, we can cure depression with AI, that we can use ChatGPT. You don't really need friends, but then you can think about, well, there's all these environmental costs of having AI. And so is really that the route, or would the route be you go out, you go to your local church, you go to your local bowling club, you go talk to your neighbor, you know, whatever it is that generates a sense of community might be one of the benefits here, right? And so that's the thing. Anytime you think, oh, technology is going to save us, you want to be worried about, are we actually getting further away from the answer? And then if we want to get to the answer, we need to back up, right? And that's the thing with evolution. You have to undo this fish, you got to back all the way up. And so every time you improve upon things, you're actually getting further away from where would be more optimal. Okay, so I'm going to end there. Just the big summary is we have cognitive limits. We're not rational, despite what we're taught in Econ 101. And just think about which traditions won in the past, what were they good at, and basically what we need in the future is what they're good at in the past going to be helpful for that, right? And maybe the cultures that were not successful in the past are good at things which might be helpful for the future, okay? So there's different degrees. I think at the very least, I would say the historically marginalized cultures, it's probably not the case that they have zero to offer, right? So they probably have something to offer, and the question is how much, right? If we're in a mismatched world, they actually have more to offer than the groups that dominate today because of their historical success. And so at least I think it's something to think about. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nunn, for your insights. I found very thought-provoking this idea that cultural traits that were deeply rooted and were helpful for the success of some societies might not be as helpful today. But that's really, I I hope this will really generate a debate, because my question for you is, for instance, why are we at a critical juncture now and not after World War II? Hasn't human beings always been at critical juncture? But I don't want to monopolize questions. I would like to invite the audience now to ask some questions. So there are 2 roving microphones, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. So please keep it brief. The gentleman here. Oh, sorry. Oh, you go ahead. All right.
Yep, I can hear you, but I don't know about online people. Yeah.
You talk about universal and high gods. You've been in Melbourne for about 3 days, I think, over the weekend. You haven't mentioned one word. Sport. Melbourne, the home of AFL, or sometimes called football. And Sydney, if you get there, rugby or thugby.
Yep.
Any commentary about sport in terms of what you've talked about tonight? Thank you.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, yeah, sport's great. So, like, how do you build in-group cohesion and create an out-group without having the violence of warfare? And then sport would be one way, right? We're able to generate this in-group cohesion because there is this, you can call it enemy, but I don't know if you call you're competing. But yeah, I think that's exactly right. So that's a bit of a hack. Like, how do we create cohesion without having all of the negative of conflict, right? So in this kind of competitive environment, that would be, yeah. So I think that's kind of one of the reasons that we're drawn to sport. And it is true, like, if I meet a Canucks fan, hockey, especially in different parts of the world, I feel a lot closer to them, only because we follow the same men skating around hitting a puck, right? Yeah. But but it is deeper than that.
Thank you. There seems to be 2 schools of thought regarding the factors which contribute to the economic success of individuals or societies. There are those who feel the factors which are responsible are endogenous, such as Acemoglu, yourself, Jeffrey Sachs, Jared Diamond, and so on. And there are those who believe that exogenous factors are responsible, such as Garrett Jones of George Mason University. Now, it seems that those on the left believe in exogenous factors, and those on the right believe in endogenous factors. So it seems that the one side believes in ideology rather than rationality. Both sides actually believe in ideology rather than rationality. That being the case, how can a common person have faith in results of economic research?
But so I'm not sure that the first statements are true. Maybe yeah, so I don't want to go into it too much, but so I would say, like, Jared Diamond believes in exogenous factors because he thinks geography, right? So how is it? It has to do with the axes. It has to do with were you endowed with horses rather than zebras, right? Things like this. Those are pretty exogenous, or at least exogenous to human action. And so other than geography, I would say everything else is endogenous, right? Everything else is the product of our creation. So I wouldn't say culture is exogenous. I wouldn't say institutions are exogenous. That's created by us. And it's a long, process. It's a dynamic process. It's hard to understand. So that's the one thing I would say. And then, so we could talk more, but then, yeah, how do you believe anything economists say? Maybe that's a deeper question. So I would say, like, as soon as any economist says there's one factor, right, it's geography and all these other guys are talking nonsense, then you shouldn't believe them, right? The world is complex. All of these things matter. They're going to interact in complex ways. And if you just say it's this one factor, I've discovered the magic bullet, you're probably trying to promote your career or something like this. And I think any serious economist that I know understands the complexity of the world and has a bit of humility in terms of when they're trying to suggest that they understand the world or suggest policy or suggest, provide implications or recommendations about what we should do to try and improve the world. Yeah.
Hi. Hi. Thank you, Professor, for your lecture. I was wondering do you consider there are alternative economic systems that are more welcoming to various cultures? because as you said, most of European or the winning cultures weren't incompatible with those losing ones. Are there like alternative economic systems like Kate Raworth's donut economics, or Piketty's, or like Kalecki's and Levi, different ways of organizing economy and society that are more welcoming to different cultures than just rather capitalism, imperialism, etc.?
Yeah. I wouldn't say so much economic systems, because that it's not clear. You could have capitalism and be welcoming of other cultures, and so. But I do think there are cultures which are more or less tolerant of other groups. I talked about that, but also more welcoming of other groups. So, traditionally African cultures, like I mentioned, they were very welcome, very happy to integrate others into their lineage. And lineage is kind of the dominant social structure. Even like there's a recent paper by Tamara McGavrick where she looks at DHS data, so survey data, and finds it's something like 40% of families in sub-Saharan Africa have their composition changed because they've brought in a child, right? Or their child has been brought into another. And so there's really the sense about bringing others in, right? And so, and this notion, within Africa of wealth and people is exactly that. Like you're bringing others into your lineage. And so that's very, very different. Even if you read the diaries of, I think this is a great example, the King Alfonso, which is the king of the Congo Kingdom, which was like the first main contact that the Portuguese made in Africa. He was very open to them and very welcoming. He actually converted to Christianity. And even when the Europeans were enslaving his citizens, he really couldn't bring himself to say, no, you can't come, right? Because he really wanted to still have them. So you can compare that to our world today, and I'm not. It's just the fact that we have, Lant Pritchett calls it global apartheid, whereas you don't have full labor mobility, right? Not saying that that's not right, but that's very different than African societies traditionally, right? And so, yeah.
Sure. Hi. Thank you. Very interesting. I'm just thinking you sort of linked a lot of the success to having a universal creator God, for example, and obviously that makes sense for us sitting here in 2025. But I'm just sort of thinking about other highly successful for an extended period empires like the Romans, the Aztecs, probably even the Mongols and so forth. And they're not monotheistic. So how have you done any thinking about how those kind of, at the time, winning societies kind of slot into the model that you've developed?
Yeah. So, I guess one thing is throughout all of this is all of these statements are like on average, so you can always like find counterexamples. And then the other thing is, I think for kingdoms, what's really important is are you willing to have complexity and then inequality? Are you willing to have some people that have more power than others? Almost like kingdoms or large states, by definition, have these different levels of authority. And so you have to be okay with the stratification, right? And so I think that's related. I can't prove it, but it's related to your view of the world, that we're all connected. And because of that, inequality affects all of us. And so we'd want to think hard before we have such severe forms of inequality, right? And so I think that's got to be part of the logic if you are to allow basically states to form and that sort of thing. So we at Monash had James Robinson, the recent Nobel Prize winner, was talking about some of his research, including his ongoing book. And he was talking about, well, in Africa, there were concerted efforts to prevent states from forming, right? It's because we didn't want inequality, because that's not the kind of society we wanted, because we recognize that we're all connected and everybody affects everyone, right? And so that is the kind of the cultural foundation I'd want to look at if we're trying to explain, well, what allowed states to form in different parts of the world, right? Yeah, and that's different than a high God, obviously. So the high God doesn't explain everything. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Time for one last quick question.
In some societies, this emphasis on relationships leads to nepotism, which can be destructive, and is in conflict with, say, a meritocracy. How does that affect things?
Yeah. So I could talk a lot about. So nepotism is, you're exactly right, is about relationships, right? And so, and our view is that's wrong, but in lots of parts of the world, that's the way things work. So one example, which is different than a meritocracy, and again at Monash I talked about this, is some societies are developed in terms of age sets. So that's basically based on your age, that determines whether you have political power or not, right? That's not a meritocracy at all. It's, it's a gerontocracy actually, right? And you might think that's like really unfair, right? And so there's been some recent scholars that said, well, where you don't have age sets, what happens is one group tends to dominate. You get this like rich elite that develops, and then they're always richer, and there's another group that's always poorer. That's the reality. But when you have these age sets, what you find is there's more equality in the cross-section of society, but then the old people have more power, and they have, maybe more wealth, right? But then that ends up being fair because everyone becomes old at some point. So when you're young, you're kind of at the bottom of the barrel. Maybe for those in academia, you can kind of like, this is resonating. You're at the bottom of the barrel, you're assistant professor, and you're frustrated, right? You don't have the power, you don't have the money. And then the standard thing they say in Africa is wait your turn. Just wait your turn, right? So that's not a meritocracy. That's very different. That seems exotic and weird to us. But when you stop and think about it, maybe that's fair. Like maybe that is more fair. And yeah, exactly. There's like and the thing about that is you go through every stage, of wealth. And whereas our societies today, where you have the top 0.1% and others, all of us aren't going to be the top 0.1%. Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for. Thanks for the great discussion. The Faculty of Business and Economics gratefully acknowledges the support that the Peter Griffin and Terry Swan Foundation provide for the promotion of economic history. And I would like now to invite to the podium Peter Griffin to share his words with us.
Thank you so much indeed for coming down under to share some of this marvelous information with us. You've taken us on a tour de force, really, across the way we humans have sort of, in a sense, shaped our planet. Good on you. Well done. And I really enjoyed it. Some of the little takeaways to me were that the cultural traits, but in the end, I wondered whether the civilizing missions that we've set off on in some ways leave us sort of not unlike those poor little turtles, heading off to the wrong light. And sometimes one wonders whether we have not got our sights properly set. But thank you indeed for coming down to share with us this wonderful talk from your wonderful city. And we hope you enjoy Melbourne a little longer while you're here. And as somebody said, they could probably get you to an Aussie rules football game while you're here. Thank you again.